Madam President. Madam President, I come to the floor today to express my support for the North Korea Sanctions Enforcement Act and the substitute that we will be voting on later this afternoon. I think it's fair to say that the people of Alaska take great interest in this legislation, and it's not simply an intellectual interest. It stems from our geography, quite simply. At its closest point, Alaska is 3,100 miles from North Korea. Now let me put that into context with where we are here. The distance between Washington, D.C. and my hometown of Anchorage is 3,370 miles. So Alaska is actually closer to North Korea than I am to my home when I am working here in Washington, D.C. When we're talking about the main population center there in Anchorage and in the Matsu area in South Central, we're about 3,600 miles from Pyongyang. So perhaps it's a little bit longer than a North Korean missile can travel today or even in the near future. But it seems to me that Korea is committed to advancing its nuclear capabilities, and its covert nuclear test and the so-called satellite launch that we saw over the weekend appear to be purposeful steps in that direction. Just to give a little vignette about how Alaskans pay attention to North Korea, we all go around and visit schools around our respective states, and I was in a middle school, and I had an 8th grader ask me a question when it comes to what's on anybody's mind, what do you want me to know about, how can I be a better representative for you back in Washington, D.C. And the first 8th grader that raises his hand says to me, so Senator Murkowski, what are you all doing in Washington about this Kim Jong-un guy? This is an 8th grader. Now, I'm not going to suggest to you that perhaps Alaskan 8th graders are more in tune to the politics around the world. The reason I raise it is because around the dinner tables back home, people are talking about North Korea because our geography puts us within that range of sight, if you will. And I use that term loosely, but when you look at the maps and you understand where Alaska sits and where North Korea sits, and you read the news about what is happening with North Korea's nuclear intentions, it causes Alaskans to be worried enough to be discussing it at the dinner table, and 8th graders saying, hey, what's going on? It's real for us. North Korea's actions demand decisive action, both here in Washington, D.C., in Beijing, and at the United Nations. The Washington Post editorial just yesterday noted that the Obama doctrine of strategic patience is no longer an option. Mr. Kim seems to view that as a sign of weakness. He seems to fancy playing Washington off against Beijing, but really neither capital can any longer afford him that luxury, lest North Korea make fools of both of us. China, in my judgment, has a major role to play in showing Mr. Kim the light. Mr. Kim wants the world to believe that he is smarter than all of us, and I would suggest that it is not in Beijing's interest to offer him a porous border. The United States and our allies have been patient enough with the carrot. We talk a lot about carrot and stick when it comes to engagement, but I would suggest that we have been patient enough with the carrot, and now it's time to try the stick. The sanctions bill that we are considering today are intended as a serious wake-up call to Mr. Kim's government. The sanctions are severe, and they are targeted at those who enable Mr. Kim's regime to conduct business abroad. They're also intended as a wake-up call to Mr. Kim's advisors, who enjoy a pretty comfortable status quo thanks to their leadership positions. But life is going to be a little bit tougher under our sanctions regime if we advance this. No more luxury goods, no more creature comforts, and if we are successful, no more access to hard currency, no exceptions. This is an important shift for our government with regards to North Korea. Now, as I mentioned, out of geographic necessity, I follow developments in North Korea very closely, and I have since I came to the Senate here. I've had opportunity over these years to spend time with U.S. officials who have assumed this very difficult role of trying to conduct diplomacy with North Korea. And almost without exception, the words that they have advised me when we're talking about North Korea is to choose respectful language, to avoid threats, to find ways to allow your words and your sincerity to penetrate. And we're now at that point where some are saying quite strongly that this respectful approach hasn't really gotten us anywhere with this regime. But I would suggest that we can be and must be very firm, while at the same time respectful. Let me share just a couple examples of some things that many of my colleagues may not have been aware of. I had an opportunity this past September to travel with a couple of my Senate colleagues here to Svalbard, Norway. Svalbard is where one of the world's global seed vaults are located. And the seed vault is intended to preserve a wide variety of plant seeds from various gene banks around the world in the event that there might be some kind of a widespread regional or a global crisis that would wipe out local crops and seeds. They've nicknamed it the Doomsday Vault, and had an opportunity to go into this vault and just observe what various nations had sent to the top of the world up there. And in that vault, we saw one of the few instances of North Korean international cooperation. We saw boxes of seeds from North Korea, or at least the box that contained all the seeds. Over 5,700 crop plant seeds from that hermit kingdom. And then just last month, North Korea signed the Svalbard Treaty, which gives North Korea legal access to the Svalbard Islands. We've also heard that North Korea has made use of the Northern Sea Route to assist with shipments to Russia. So I put this out there because for whatever the reason may be that North Korea signed on to the Svalbard Treaty, and whatever the reason it may be for its newfound interest in the Arctic, the point is that when the regime in North Korea sees that it is in its international best interests, there is a willingness to engage. But to this point, they have not shown a willingness to engage when it comes to their nuclear and their ballistic missile programs, at least not to any reasonable level of engagement where the terms are not dictated by the North Korean regime. So here we are today. We have a bill on the floor directed to North Korea. It is about economic sanctions. It's not about an invasion or the use of offensive weapons against the people of North Korea. It's about bringing about peaceful change firmly, and respectfully. And in that vein, let me acknowledge that the people of North Korea, I believe, are proud. They're a nationalistic people, and like all of the world's people, they wish to be respected, but they are governed by an intolerant regime and a very perplexing regime, a regime that tolerates hunger and poverty when it is clear that there are other choices. If the people of North Korea were allowed to look across that border, they would see an example of prosperity. They would see a strong commitment to traditional values. They would see family members with whom someday they would hope to reunify. None of the world's nations are out to deny North Korea the opportunities for that prosperity and traditional values and reuniting with families. But we do demand, and rightly so, it is legitimate that we demand that North Korea choose to be part of the community of nations, and that means that Mr. Kim must abandon these nuclear ambitions. Madam President, I believe that it is important that our nation be prepared for anything that may come our way. My home state of Alaska is host to our nation's ground-based missile defense capabilities. I was pleased to read in yesterday's budget announcement plans to make a $1 billion investment in the ground-based missile defense system. Significant investments are also made in the long-range discrimination radar, the LIDAR, which is slated for completion at Clear Air Force Station by the year 2020. That radar is exactly what the words imply, a radar that will enable our missile defenders to take a really good, long look and better discriminate between threats and junk. I'm also pleased to know that the U.S. is working through the placement of missile defense batteries in South Korea. I think that these investments provide an increment of protection, but the truth is they are second best to a change in attitude coming out of Pyongyang. And that is truly what I hope we achieve through this sanctions vote that we will take later today. With that, Madam President, I thank you, I yield the floor, and I suggest